I was asked to disclose any interest I might have, so here's my disclosure. And I would like to start with a memory of Jorge Osvaldo, who passed away last 17th of August. So when I accepted to talk about quality of life, I said yes, but at the same time, I was also very doubting about, I think it's a very complicated issue. It's a subjective issue. Everybody can look at it from its own way. So let me start to go through the years and see how quality of life has evolved, and then I will come back to some points which you can discuss in the rest of the meeting. So let's go back to, this photo is taken in 1985 when with my current husband, when we lived in Amsterdam, and we decided to move over in 1986 to Barcelona, where we were diagnosed with HIV. And at that moment there was no treatment. The only thing we had was CD4 counts. That was the only way we measured how your perspective of life was going, which wasn't very long. So that was the only thing we could do. Then there was a discussion about should you start with AZT or not. The first doctor we had said no, you have to wait till you're very low with your CD4 count, and at least you have some benefit from it. But we decided to move over to a big hospital where Jose Maria is working, and that doctor had another opinion. He said, no, we have to attack the virus. So at that moment, there was a clinical trial, which was AZT and interferon. That's not the interferon you know nowadays. We had to start the first months like 5 injections 5 times a week, and then after that it was 3 times a week. So we were doing this clinical trial, and we were always interested in traveling, and with a short perspective of life, you always try to escape from that reality. So in 1919, we decided, and probably you can't remember that, but in 1919 there wasn't Schengen yet, so we still had the borders, and at that moment there was a war going on in Yugoslavia. So to get to Greece, that was our goal, we had to go with the car through the south of Italy and then move over with the ferry to Greece. And so we had to bring this interferon with us. So 2 persons with interferon, a lot of cases and a lot of syringes, and we thought, and we had to pass the border and the police there, and they had to check, and we thought, well, how we do this? So we bought this cool box, which you could plug in the cigarette lighter. I don't think that the new cars have a cigarette lighter anymore, but we could do that. And we arrived at the border with Italy, and I remember that the guys from the border, they were so amazed about the cool box and how it was stuck in the lighter that they didn't look inside the cool box. So we had all these interferon cases and some yogurts on top of that, but so we could pass through Italy easily. But at that moment, and I tell you this because what's quality of life? If there is a short perspective of life, your quality of life depends on the manner of your will be staying alive or not. So injecting interferon, which is not a lot of fun, really didn't matter. The thing was to survive. That was our quality of life at the moment. And then after 2 years of shooting interferon, they told us we could stop because it didn't give the results that were expected. And then we tried different clinical trials, and luckily enough there was one in 94, 95 with a protease inhibitor when CD4 counts were already below 40. And I think that saved our life, and that's the reason we are still here. And so in 96, when we have the triple combination of antiretroviral drugs, then people, then we saw that mortality really dropped dramatically. But also, these new drugs gave a lot of side effects, or there were a lot of pills, or pills you could take with food, or you shouldn't take it with food, or you couldn't take it together. You had to 3-4 times a day. So it was very complicated, and lipodystrophy was a phenomenon that came up, and that caused that a lot of people maybe stopped sometime with the treatment. So here we see a change in the quality of life, where people really weren't so worried about dying, but were more worried about the daily life and how they functioned during that period of time. And then the last period, the drugs were getting better. Jonathan already showed that with all the criteria. People could take them better, so we had also the results. START studies showed that it's better to start as early as possible with the treatment. And there was an improved detection of HIV. We started the Barcelona checkpoint, and we are able to detect people really in the first phases of the infection. And in combination with early treatment really we will see a new generation of people living with HIV, as Jonathan mentioned. But on the other side, we have to remember that probably 50% of people living with HIV will be over 50 years, and in the coming years it will be over 70% of those people. So the whole thing, one of the things we have to look when we think about quality of life is about how we are getting older. And there are some criteria to think about successful aging, about avoiding any disease or disease-related disability, including avoidance of risk factors for morbidity. Secondly, a high cognitive and physical functional capacity, sustaining the physical, mental, emotional aptitude to performing activities. And last but not least, an active engagement with life, which include maintaining productivity and keeping valuable interpersonal relationships. Now, there are some research priorities which coincides perfectly with this criteria, and they are not in a specific order, but I think these are 3 research priorities where we have to focus on. First, cognitive function and memory loss. Secondly, depression and isolation. And third, inflammation and related comorbidities. Now, if we talk about clinical trials and clinical effectiveness and economical effectiveness of treatment, that's fine, but it doesn't tell us how a patient feels or functions. So what really is needed to include in clinical trials is patient-based evidence that includes measurements of well-being. And I show here the UPATI. It's a European project. It has a very nice website where you can look up a lot of tools. And the objective is to include an increasing focus on the development of patient reported outcomes, which are based on a patient's perception of a disease and or treatment. Now, the patient-reported outcomes are important because they provide a patient perspective on disease or treatment that might be or might not be captured by a clinical measurement, but is as important to the patient as a clinical measurement, and can answer questions like, how does the patient feel about this new treatment, or how does it affect his daily activity? The results of patient-reported outcome can lead to a medical science that's more focused on real benefits achievable for the patients. And the patient-related reported outcomes must be carefully defined and measured so that we can compare them between the different studies. Now, I'm sorry. Now, to define the measurements and how we measure these patient-related outcomes, I'm sorry, it's important to involve the community. And as an example, I've taken the HIV aging research. I need some water, probably. Sorry. I take the HIV aging research project from Palm Springs. They've been working a huge time in this project, and it is described as a community-based, community-supported coalition, not only of people living with HIV, but also with healthcare providers, their advocates, families, and friends. And their objective is to enable long-term survivors to live well, despite their chronic HIV infection, through research of their needs, but not only of their needs, but also to offer them care, treatment, and social networks. Now, this project considers that research not always reflects the opinions of people getting older. So they organized different research focus groups, and these focus groups identified 5 major areas. First, the long-term side effects of medication. Second, social determinants of health, mental health, resiliencies, and involvement of the community in HIV research. Now, of every area of these discussions in these focus group, I've picked up one example of an opinion of people who were, all the people who were involved in this discussion. So the long-term side effects of medication. This includes worries, anxieties regarding the possible side effects of extended years or decades of use of antiretrovirals and other HIV-related medication. So a 69-year-old male explained, "I've been on drugs for so long. What's the price we're going to pay for living this long and taking these drugs, and the effects they're going to have on parts of our bodies?" And maybe you've seen in the last QoL there was a study published about taking drugs only 4 days a week. Now, you can imagine that on the mailing list, this is an issue that is quite interested by people, because although they have the HIV under control and the viral load, still the idea of taking less toxicity, which is equal to drugs, is one of their interests. Social determinants of health, which focuses on the importance of housing, access to insurance, competent medical care, in a context of people where people were born, grown up, lived, worked, and aged. And also the system, the mechanisms they have to deal with illnesses. This is a quote from a 69-year-old transgender. A lot of folks may be living relatively close to the edge in terms of financial stability. And having some support to prevent people from just falling off the financial cliff is a good thing. That's why we have an emergency fund for the trans community, just to keep people from falling into the abyss. Mental health. Mental health includes depression, isolation. This is one of the issues that affects 2/3 of the people living with HIV, and especially the older generation. About depression, I go over to his house and he's on the bedroom floor, and he hadn't eaten in 3 or 4 days. He couldn't even get off the floor. We ended up having a call to call an ambulance and then transport him to the hospital. I still check on him every once in a while, but he has 2 sons. They don't care about him, and he just got depressed and stopped eating. Or in relation to isolation from all our friends who have died. My partner and I are early. I'm 70, he's nearly 70, and I have no close friends. They all died. Everybody is dead. Resiliencies, which represents strengths to have allowed participants to age successfully while living with HIV. There's an interesting area which was also studied and published a lot about by Ronald Stoll. I picked this quote. I have a lot of straight friends with health issues who are like, they don't ask the doctor questions. They don't look anything up on the internet. They take whatever is given to them. And the fact that that we have been sort of trained to ask questions to our doctors, that's a part of our resiliences. That's we've learned to be in charge of our health. Involvement of community in HIV research. And this is a quote from a researcher. Research organizations should have a commitment to the community, staying in the community, rather than coming in, poaching research subjects and leaving, so that researchers get the journal article published, but without any sort of sustained work in the community. So these are 5 issues and quotes, just to give you an idea about how we can help to focus and include patient outcomes in our research. So in summary, a shift from targeted disease-specific management to geriatric-based models, in which the emphasis is on maintaining quality of life and well-being for as long as possible, is important. And increased quality of life may be reached with the help, interest, compassion, and empathy of healthcare providers for detecting problems, because that's the issue. It's not looking at CD4 counts, viral load. It's detecting one of these issues during the visit of your patients. And also taking an active part in the solution process and not sending to another referrals which doesn't work and end up in nothing. So I want to make a final remark before finishing up. I talked to you about Jorge. He was born in 1941 in Buenos Aires. So you can imagine in the 50s, his coming out wasn't very easy. He had to be very resilient. He had a heart attack and was on drugs just to control the cardiovascular disease. Upon that, he got HIV. He moved to Barcelona, but he was fine. He was dealing very well with both diseases and the medication. And at 77, he was diagnosed with an anal cancer. And so the only thing that was said to him that the cancer should be removed. And to remove, it was in surgery, he had to go to a nurse home and probably had to wear a bag. Now, this perspective for him was very, very difficult. Talking about quality of life was difficult because he was living independently. And just to go to a nurse house where you can't do what you want to do was very difficult. So he called me because he heard about this Australian guy who went to Switzerland and tried to die there. And he asked me about Dutch laws about euthanasia. And so it was quite complicated. At the end, he was able to purchase a liquid that came from Mexico. Not an easy process, and it cut at his home in Barcelona. And then he was very convinced that it was the end of his time. And then one day he made a reflection to me, and he said, because you know, here in Spain, it's still punishable to help people die. And he said, listen, I have to be, if I do it, I have to do it all by myself. But why? Why couldn't I be with people who care about me, who loves me? And so he wasn't able to do so. And at the end, luckily enough, there was a change from his family doctor who helped him to a palliative care place. And he was sedated and died tranquil. He was at peace with himself. But it made the last remark. Quality of life is also having the right to decide when to die with dignity and surrounded with the love of your family and friends. Thank you very much.